Please don't come back. Not tonight. Not ever. That was what my stepmother said, through the locked front door on Christmas Eve. Snow falling on my canvas duffel bag. My breath turning white in the porch light. I was 22 years old. I had $20 in my coat pocket. Every cent I had saved from skipping breakfast for 3 years straight. My father stood behind her. He did not open the door. He did not even look at me. He just watched his wife pull the curtain shut. And her daughter Brinley. She stood on the second floor landing and lifted her phone and filmed me. Filmed me crying in the snow. Then she laughed, loud enough that I could hear it through the glass. And she said, into her camera, "Merry Christmas, loser." She posted that video to her friends that same night. 20 seconds long. She added a laughing emoji. She did not know that 3 years later, that exact video would cost her mother a job, a marriage, and the house she stole from me. She did not know that a stranger was already waiting for me 12 miles away. A woman I had never met, holding a brass key my grandmother had left behind 7 years earlier. She did not know that my last $12 were about to buy a condemned train depot in the Allegheny foothills. And she certainly did not know what my grandmother had hidden under the floor of the ticket booth in 1955, and had been waiting 68 years for me to find. My name is Wren Prosser, and this is the story of how the worst night of my life became the first honest night of my life, and how the women who came before me built me a home, before I even knew I would need one. To understand what happened, you have to understand the women who came before me. My grandmother was Cordelia Sutcliffe, born in 1937 in a rail town called Coldwater, Pennsylvania. Youngest of 5 children. Only girl. Her father was a fireman on the coal locomotives out of Scranton. Her mother took in laundry. Cordelia went to work on the railroad in 1958 at the age of 21. First as a clerk. Then, when the Union finally cracked, as one of the first women switchmen east of the Mississippi. Do you know what a switchman does? She threw the levers that changed the tracks. She stood in freezing rain and 100-degree heat and pushed steel by hand. She had shoulders like a bricklayer by the time she was 30. She wore men's overalls because they did not make women's. She was told twice a week for the first 10 years that she should go home and have babies. She did not go home. She stayed on the line for 41 years. She retired in 1999. She was the second woman ever to earn a full pension on the Bedford Division. She kept a brass compass in her breast pocket every single day of her working life. She said a railroad woman should always know which direction she was going, even when the tracks did not. My mother was Wren Prosser, born in 1972. Cordelia raised her mostly alone. My grandfather ran off when my mother was 4. Cordelia did not remarry. She did not want to. She said one husband had been enough for one lifetime. Then she laughed. She had a laugh like train brakes coming down. Loud, sudden, and always aimed at the world. My mother tried to be different. She wore dresses. She took secretarial classes. She worked in a bank for 3 years. Then, on a Monday morning in 1995, she walked into the bank manager's office and quit, and went straight to the rail yard, and filled out an application for a dispatcher trainee position. She told my grandmother that night that the bank had felt like wearing somebody else's skin. My grandmother nodded once, and poured her a glass of the good whiskey she kept above the refrigerator, and they sat at the kitchen table until midnight, saying almost nothing. That is a Sutcliffe woman thing. We do not need to talk to understand each other. My mother married my father in 1999. Emmett Prosser. He was an accountant. Quiet, kind at first. He wore glasses and read the newspaper front to back every morning. I was born in the fall of 2000. For the first 15 years of my life, my mother came home every evening in her work boots. She smelled like diesel and cold coffee and the sweet sharp scent of the rail yard in winter. She taught me the names of the different kinds of freight cars, boxcars, gondolas, hoppers, tank cars, reefers. She taught me how to read a timetable. She taught me that gravity does not lie, and steel does not lie, and a train will arrive when it will arrive. She died in March of my 15th year. A coupling accident in the yard north of Bedford. It was quick. That is what they told me. Quick. I did not cry at the funeral. Not because I did not want to. Because I did not know how yet. That would come later. My grandmother outlived my mother by 22 months. She died of heart failure on a Sunday morning in her armchair. The brass compass was open on the table beside her. The needle was pointing north. It always pointed north. I was 17. I was the last Sutcliffe woman left. I put the compass on a leather cord around my neck the day after her funeral, and I wore it every day for the next 5 years. My father did not handle any of it well. For the first year, after my mother died, he barely spoke. In the second year, he met a woman at a grief support group. Her name was Darlene Voss. She was a widow. She had a daughter my age named Brinley. She wore expensive perfume and laughed too loud at things that were not funny. He married her in the spring of my 19th year. She moved into our house within a month. Brinley moved into my bedroom. I was moved into the storage room above the garage. There was no heat up there. My father said it was temporary. It was not temporary. Darlene did not like me. She never said so. She did not have to. She sold my mother's coat to a consignment shop without asking me. She threw out my mother's cookbooks. She took the framed photograph of my grandmother in her switchman uniform off the mantel and put it in a box in the basement. I found the photograph the next morning. I put it back on the mantel. It was gone again by dinner. The third time, I hid it under my mattress in the storage room. Darlene threw out my grandmother's cast iron skillet, the one Cordelia had cooked in for 40 years, because it did not match the new kitchen. Darlene threw out the little wooden train my mother had carved for me when I was 6, because it was clutter. Darlene threw out the letter my grandmother had left me, the one I was supposed to open on my 21st birthday. I found it in the recycling bin on a Tuesday morning, torn in half. I taped it back together. I still have it. I have not opened it yet. I am saving it. I do not know for what. I got a job at 17 at a diner on Route 22 called Marty's. I worked the 6 a.m. shift before school, then the 4 p.m. shift after school. I saved every dollar I made. I put it in a coffee can under a loose floorboard in the storage room. Darlene found the coffee can when I was 18. She took $240 out of it. She called it rent. I started keeping my money in my locker at the diner instead. Marty did not ask why. I skipped breakfast for 3 years. Not because I was on a diet. Because a bagel at the diner cost me $2 I could otherwise save. I had saved $20. $20. Do the math. That means Darlene had gone through my savings more than once. I stopped keeping money anywhere she could find it. I kept my last $20 folded in a slit inside the lining of my winter coat. That is the coat I was wearing on Christmas Eve. The Christmas Eve. The one when everything ended and everything else began. 3 weeks before Christmas, I found the papers on Darlene's desk. I was not snooping. I was looking for scissors. She had asked me to wrap presents for Brinley, because Brinley did not want to wrap her own. The scissors were on the desk itself, under a stack of documents. The documents had my grandmother's name on them. Cordelia Sutcliffe. Property transfer. Signed and dated November of 2020. 3 years after my grandmother had been in the ground. The house. Our house. The little white 2-story on Marigold Street that the railroad had deeded to my grandmother in 1968 as part of her pension package. The house my mother had grown up in. The house I had grown up in. The house that legally belonged to me the moment my grandmother died, because my mother was already gone. That house was now in Darlene's name. I read the papers 3 times. My hand started shaking on the 4th read. The signature on the transfer was my father's. But it was not exactly my father's. I had watched my father sign things my whole life. The way he made his E was distinctive. He always looped it back on itself like a small figure 8. This he did not loop. This he was flat. Either my father had signed the papers under duress, or someone had signed them for him. Either way, she had stolen it. I put the papers back exactly where I found them. I wrapped Brinley's presents. My hands felt very still and very cold. I waited until Christmas Eve. I do not know why I waited. I wish I had confronted her sooner, but I think part of me still hoped. Hope is the last thing to die. My grandmother used to say that. She said it was also the most expensive thing a woman could carry. On Christmas Eve, I came downstairs from the storage room at 7 in the evening. Snow was falling. The house smelled like the ham Darlene was baking, and the cheap pine candle Brinley kept lighting. I walked into the kitchen. Darlene was arranging cookies on a platter. She looked up. I said, "I saw the papers." She did not blink. She just picked up another cookie and placed it on the platter. She said, "What papers?" I said, "The house." She said, "What about it?" I said, "It was my grandmother's. It was supposed to be mine." She said, "It was your father's. Legally. That counts." I said, "Not when I am alive." She said, "You are being dramatic." I said, "I saw the transfer. It is in your name now." She said, "Yes." And that was it. Just and. Like theft was a normal thing you did on a Tuesday. My father walked into the kitchen then. He was carrying a bottle of wine. He froze when he saw my face. I said, "Dad, did you sign those papers?" He looked at Darlene. That look told me everything. He said, "Wren, it is complicated." I said, "It is not complicated. Did you sign them?" He said, "I do not want to have this conversation on Christmas Eve." Darlene laughed then. A small laugh. Almost embarrassed. Like she was watching a child throw a tantrum in a grocery store. She said, "Wren, this is not your house. This has never been your house. You are 22. It is time to grow up." I said, "That was my grandmother's house." She said, "Your grandmother is dead." I do not remember what my face did, but something must have happened, because my father took a step back, and Darlene's smile faltered. Then she said the thing she had been saving. She said, "You know what? I do not want you here anymore. And your father agrees with me, don't you?" She turned to him. He did not answer. She said, "Emmett," he said. "Darlene, maybe not tonight." She said, "Yes, tonight. Say it." And he said it. he said. Maybe it is time. Wren, you are an adult now. He said it looking at the floor. I stood in that kitchen for maybe 10 seconds. Then I turned around and I went upstairs. I got my canvas duffel bag from under the cot. I put in 3 shirts, 2 pairs of jeans, my mother's photograph, my grandmother's photograph, the taped-together letter, my grandmother's brass compass, which I always wore anyway. I zipped the bag. I came down the stairs. I put on my winter coat. I checked the lining. $20. Still there. Darlene was standing at the bottom of the stairs. Arms folded. She said, "Give me your key." I gave her my key. She said, "And don't come back. Not tonight. Not ever." I walked to the front door. I opened it. I stepped out onto the porch. She closed the door behind me. I heard the deadbolt turn. I turned around, and I looked up at the second-floor landing. Brinley was standing at the landing window. She had her phone up. She was filming me. She waved. Then she laughed. I walked down the porch steps. The street was empty. Christmas lights on the neighbors' houses. My grandmother had a saying, "When your feet are cold and your heart is colder, walk. Walk anywhere. Just walk. The walking will tell you where." So I walked. I walked 12 blocks in the falling snow. My feet chose. My feet took me to the old station. I ended up at the Bedford local depot. That was the little wooden station off 4th Street where my mother had worked as a dispatcher and where my grandmother had worked as a switchman before that. It was still operational in a limited way. 2 commuter trains a day. It was open 24 hours because it also served as a shelter for the yard workers. There was a woman inside, 69 years old, gray hair in a long braid, wearing a heavy blue coat with a railroad patch on the shoulder, mopping the tile floor with a slow, steady rhythm that made my throat close. She looked up when I opened the door. She saw me standing there with my duffel bag and my red eyes and the snow in my hair. She stopped mopping. She looked at me for a long time, longer than a stranger would. She set her mop down. Very carefully. She said, "Oh, honey," she said, "you are Cordelia's granddaughter." I could not speak. I nodded. She said, "You have the exact frown line she got when she was mad at the world." She walked across the tile floor. Her knees clicked. She stopped a foot away from me. She reached up, and she put both her hands on my cheeks. Cold hands. She said, "You are Marlene's daughter, too. You have her mouth." I made a sound. It was not a word. It was the sound a person makes when the last thing holding them up finally gives out. She caught me. She was smaller than I was, but she caught me. She wrapped both arms around me, and she held me, while I cried, into the shoulder of her heavy blue railroad coat that smelled exactly like my grandmother's coat had smelled. She said, "My name is Hazel Kominski. I worked with your grandmother for 28 years. She was my sister in every way that ever mattered, and her granddaughter is not going to sleep in a bus station on Christmas Eve." She locked up the station. She walked me 8 blocks through the snow to a small apartment above a coin laundry, up a narrow wooden staircase, into a warm kitchen that smelled like cinnamon and old books. She sat me at her kitchen table. She poured me a bowl of soup. She poured me a mug of coffee. She sat across from me, and she waited. When I could finally speak, I said, "She threw me out." Hazel said, "Who threw you out?" I said, "My stepmother." Hazel said, "On Christmas Eve." I said, "Yes." Hazel closed her eyes. When she opened them, they were wet. She said, "Your grandmother told me this would happen." I said, "What?" Hazel got up from the table. She walked to a small wooden hutch in the corner. She opened the bottom drawer. She lifted out a wooden box the size of a shoebox. She brought it back to the table. She said, "Open it." Inside was a folded piece of thick paper and a brass key, old, small, with a delicate loop at the top. Hazel said, "Your grandmother gave that to me in 2016, 9 months before she died." She said, "Hazel, you are the only person on this earth I trust with this. If my granddaughter ever needs a real fresh start, not a job, not a rented room, not a boyfriend, a real one, from the ground up, then you give her this box." She unfolded the piece of paper. It was a hand-drawn map. My grandmother's slanted, careful handwriting. A road winding into the foothills. A small X drawn at a bend. At the top, 3 words. Millbrook Junction. Waiting. That was all. She had drawn this map 7 years ago, before she died, because she had known. Hazel let me cry. When I was quiet, she said, "Tomorrow is Christmas Day. Nothing is open. But the day after is Wednesday. And on Wednesday, I am going to walk you to the library. And we are going to find out what your grandmother left for you." I slept that night on Hazel's couch, under 2 heavy quilts, sewn by hand. Her mother had made them in 1962. They did not fail me. For the first time in 4 years, I slept in a place where no one was going to open the door in the morning and tell me to get out. I slept for 11 hours. Wednesday came bright and cold. Hazel made pancakes. Real syrup. From a tin. We walked to the Bedford Public Library. I typed, "Millbrook Junction, Bedford County." The first result was a Wikipedia article. Millbrook Junction was a small stop on the Bedford branch of the old Pennsylvania Railroad. Built in 1911. Closed in 1955. The second result was a Bedford County government page. Millbrook Junction Depot. Abandoned property. Scheduled for demolition. Spring 2025. Auction price $12. I read it 3 times. Then I looked at Hazel. I said, $12. Hazel said, $12. I said, "I have 20. Hazel said, "Then you have money left over." I called the number. A woman answered. Middle-aged voice. Professional. She said, "Bedford County Records. Merle Radcliffe speaking." I said, "My name is Wren Prosser. I am calling about the Millbrook Junction Depot listing." There was a pause. A longer pause than I expected. Then she said, "Miss Prosser, can you come in tomorrow morning? Please, as early as you can." I said, Yes. I can be there by 10. She said, "Good. Come to the 2nd floor. Room 204. I will be waiting for you." She hung up. I stood there, with the receiver in my hand. I said to Hazel. She sounded strange. Hazel said, "Strange how?" I said, like she had been expecting my call. Hazel said, "HM." That was all. Just HM. The next morning, I took 3 buses to Bedford. Hazel gave me $40 for the fare. She would not let me refuse it. The Bedford County Records office was in an old stone courthouse. I climbed to the 2nd floor. I found room 204. A woman was sitting behind a wide wooden counter. 55 maybe. Silver-streaked brown hair. Glasses on a chain. A cardigan over a plaid blouse. She stood up when she saw my face. She said, "Miss Prosser." I said, "Yes." She said, "Please, come in. Sit down." I sat. She sat back down across from me. She folded her hands. She took a breath, like a woman about to tell a story she had rehearsed for years. She said, "In 2010, a woman named Cordelia Sutcliffe walked into this office. She sat exactly where you are sitting right now." I felt my heart do that slow winding down thing again. She said, she was 73. She was carrying a canvas bag with $3,000 in it. Cash. She said she wanted to pay to keep the Millbrook Junction depot from being demolished for as long as she could. I could not speak. Merle went on. She said the property was to remain on the books at $12, because that was the price of the last passenger ticket sold from Millbrook Junction on the last day it was in operation. June 17, 1955. I could feel the brass compass under my shirt, cold against my breastbone. Merle said the property was to be held until March 31st, 2025. That was the outside limit. After that date, the county would be free to demolish. And she said, if anyone with the last name Sutcliffe or Prosser ever walked through that door and asked about the property, I was to give them this folder, and I was to sell them the property for the $12. Immediately, I said, "Ms. Radcliffe, when did you take this job?" She said, 1998. She said, I have been sitting behind this desk for 26 years. I met your grandmother in 2010. She was one of the most memorable people I have ever spoken to. Then she left, and I put her folder in that drawer, and I waited. She said, "Miss Prosser, it is January 2nd, 2023. You have come 3 months before the outside deadline, but you have come." I sat very still. I said, "She knew." Merle said, "Knew what?" I said, "She knew somebody would eventually do to me what somebody has done to me. She knew I would need somewhere to go." Merle nodded slowly. She said, "Your grandmother said something to me before she left that day. Something I have never forgotten." She said, "Merle, when a Sutcliffe woman knows a storm is coming, she does not wait for it. She builds the roof 20 years early." Something broke in me then. Not sadness. More like relief. The kind of relief that hurts. I cried for the second time in 3 days, which was more than I had cried in the 4 years before. Merle waited. She did not offer me a tissue. She just sat. When I was done, she pushed a form across the desk. She said, "Sign here, and here, and here." I signed my full name, Wren Prosser, in the careful slanted hand my grandmother had taught me when I was 7. I gave her a $10 bill and 2 ones from my coat lining. She put the $12 in a small metal cash box. She stamped the deed with a brass stamp that made a soft flat sound. She said, "Congratulations, Miss Prosser. You are the owner of the Millbrook Junction depot." She said, "My husband drives the county truck. He can drive you out there this afternoon. It is 1.5 miles up the old railbed." I said, "Yes, please." She stood. She held out her hand. I stood. I shook it. She held my hand a second longer than a handshake. She said, "Now go see what she left you." I walked out of that office into the winter sunlight. Bedford County spread below me. Church steeples. A frozen river. The rolling hills of the Allegheny foothills going blue in the distance. I put my hand on the brass compass under my shirt. The needle was pointing north. Ellis Radcliffe was a quiet man. He drove a Greene County pickup truck that had been rebuilt more times than it had been new. He did not ask me a single question on the ride out. He just drove up a narrow county road that wound into the foothills like a piece of gray ribbon somebody had dropped on a green table. The trees were bare. It was January. The sky was the color of old tin. After 20 minutes, he turned off the county road onto a gravel track. The track ran straight through the woods. Straight in a way that only one thing runs straight through woods. An old rail bed. You could still see the ballast under the leaves. The gray crushed stone that had held the ties in place for 60 years. The rails were gone. The ties were gone. But the ballast remembered. Land remembers. My grandmother used to say that. We drove 1.5 miles up that rail bed. Then the woods opened up. And there it was. The Millbrook Junction Depot. The building was small. Maybe 40 feet long. Single story. Dark red board and batten siding faded to the color of old brick dust. A steep shingle roof, with half the shingles missing on the freight room end. A tall brick chimney. And, on the side facing the empty rail bed, a bay window. The kind of small octagonal bay window a station agent sits in to watch for incoming trains. Above the bay window, painted on a dark green board in faded white letters that had once been crisp and were now soft as chalk, Millbrook JCT, Pen RR. The platform ran the length of the building. Weathered boards, green with moss at the edges. A wooden bench beside the door. The bench had a spider web strung across one arm of it that caught the light. Everything was very quiet. The kind of quiet that only exists in a place that no train has visited in 68 years. Ellis handed me a padlock key. He said, "Take your time. I'll be in the truck." I got out. I walked toward the building. My boots crunched on the frozen gravel. The brass compass was cold against my collarbone. I climbed onto the platform. The boards creaked, but they held. I stood in front of the door. The padlock was old and rusted. The key turned with a scrape that sounded like a small animal clearing its throat. The door swung open. The smell hit me first. Cold cinder. Old paper. Pine boards. A faint sweetness that I did not recognize. I stepped inside. The waiting room was one long rectangular space. A slate floor, scuffed soft by 60 years of feet. Dark wainscoting to shoulder height, painted a green, so old it had gone almost gray. A long wooden bench built into the wall on one side. A black cast iron potbelly stove in one corner. And at the far end, a closed wooden door in the wall beneath the bay window. The ticket booth. I walked slowly. I did not touch anything at first. I felt like I should not touch anything. I put my hand on the cold iron of the stove. Then on the wooden bench. Then on the closed door of the ticket booth. I turned the brass knob. The door opened. The booth was small. Maybe 6 feet square. A high wooden agent's desk faced the bay window. A tall wooden stool stood behind the desk. Rows of pigeonholes were built into the wall above the desk. A small iron safe sat in the corner. Its combination dial was rusted solid. And on the wall opposite the desk was a chalkboard. The last entry still faintly ghosted on it in white chalk that had survived 68 winters. 6:42 p.m. eastbound. Final. I stood there, reading it. 6:42. The last train. June 17, 1955. I sat down on the wooden stool. I looked out, through the bay window, at the empty rail bed. And I thought about my grandmother. 17 years old. sitting on a stool exactly like this one. Somewhere in this building, 70 years ago, a young woman with my face had sat and learned to read a timetable. I slid off the stool and I knelt down. The floorboards under the stool. They were a slightly different color than the boards around them. Darker. My hand started shaking. I ran my fingertips along the seam, where the darker boards met the lighter ones. There was a gap. Deliberate. Smooth cut. I went out to the freight room. I found a short flat iron bar on the floor. Maybe part of a switch lever once. I brought it back. I knelt. I wedged the flat end under the edge of the darker boards. They came up. Together. In one small hinge section. About 18 inches square. 2 leather hinges on one side, hardened with age, but not broken. I lifted the section. There was a small wooden compartment fitted into the floor joists. Inside the compartment, 3 things. A tin lockbox. A sealed envelope. Thick paper. Ink faded brown with age. And a folded American flag. Small. Neatly folded in the triangular military fold. I lifted them out. One at a time. I set them on the floor beside me. I sat back on my heels. I opened the lockbox first. Inside, in neat stacked rows, bundled banknotes. Old ones. $20 bills with Andrew Jackson on them. $50 bills with Ulysses S. Grant. A thin stack of $100 bills held together with paper bands that crumbled when I touched them. I counted them. Slowly. $9,400. $9,400. Beneath the bills, a small leather pouch. I opened it. Inside, wrapped in tissue paper that flaked like dry skin, 15 silver dollars. Peace dollars and Morgan dollars. The kind of coins a person put away in a drawer at the end of the Depression because they did not trust paper money anymore. And underneath the pouch, a small object wrapped in a piece of oiled leather. I unwrapped it. It was a compass. A brass pocket compass. Almost exactly the size of my grandmother's. Almost exactly the same shape. But older. Heavier. I turned it over. There was an engraving on the back. In fine copperplate. I had to hold it up to the light. For C. S. From J. A. Millbrook, 1954. I stopped breathing. C. S. Cordelia Sutcliffe. I set the compass down on the floor. I picked up the envelope. I opened it. The letter inside was folded 3 times. Heavy cream paper. The ink brown with age. But the handwriting still clear. I read it. To whoever finds this. My name is Josiah Ashcroft. I have been the station agent at Millbrook Junction on the Bedford branch of the Pennsylvania Railroad since 1937. I have also served on Sundays as a lay pastor at the small Methodist chapel 1 mile west of this depot. My wife Adeline passed in the influenza wave of '49. We had no children. Today is June 17, 1955. The branch line is being closed. The last passenger train will run on Friday evening. After that, the rails will be pulled. I am 63 years old. And I have made my peace with that. But I want to leave this letter behind for someone. I do not know who. I saved a portion of every paycheck I ever drew in this small box beneath the floor of the ticket booth for 26 years. I do not trust banks. I lost what little I had in a local bank failure in 1933, and I have not put $1 in a bank since. The silver dollars are from my late wife Adeline's family. Her father was a coal miner in Cambria County, and he put a silver dollar away every payday for 30 years. Adeline saved them after his death. She meant to give them to our children. When we had none, she gave them to me. She said, "Josiah, some day these will belong to a girl who needs them." The compass and the leather. I want to tell you about the compass, because it matters. In the summer of 1954, the railroad sent me a summer intern. A young woman, 17 years old, Coldwater, Pennsylvania. Her name was Cordelia Sutcliffe. Her father was a fireman on the coal locomotives, and he had written a letter to the division superintendent asking whether his daughter might be permitted to spend a summer learning the work. I will confess, I did not want her. I was 52 years old, a widower, and set in my ways. I did not know how to talk to a 17-year-old girl. But Cordelia Sutcliffe was not a girl to be taught. She was a girl to be gotten out of the way of. She read the timetable in 3 days. She had memorized the entire Bedford branch schedule by the end of the first week. By the second week, she was correcting my arithmetic on the freight bills. Politely, but firmly. And she was almost always right. She was the smartest person I had ever worked with, male or female. And I told her so. At the end of the summer, when it was time for her to go back to school, I gave her the pocket compass you now hold. It had belonged to my father, who had been a switchman on the Erie. I had it engraved at the jeweler's in Bedford. I told her, "Cordelia, a railroad woman should always know which direction she is going, even when the tracks do not." She looked at me very seriously. She was 17, and she looked at me like she was 40. She said, "Mr. Ashcroft, thank you. I will carry this every day, and I will come back." She did not come back. The railroad sent her to the main line the following summer. She wrote me one letter. A long, careful letter. She said she was sorry. She said Millbrook Junction was her favorite place in Pennsylvania. I wrote her back. I told her not to apologize. I told her the tracks in a young woman's life are laid by her elders, but the walking is her own. I wrote once more. In 1949, after Adeline died. She wrote back a beautiful letter. She was working as a clerk in the Coldwater yard. I did not write again, because it seemed to me that a man of my age should not be corresponding, however innocently, with a young woman making her own way in the world. But I have never stopped thinking of her. If you are reading this letter, and you are Cordelia Sutcliffe, or a daughter of Cordelia Sutcliffe, or a daughter of Cordelia Sutcliffe, I want you to know that this depot has been waiting for you. Everything in it is for you. The money, the silver dollars, the compass, which was hers already. If you are not related to Cordelia Sutcliffe, if you are simply a person who has come into this depot looking for shelter or a place to begin again, then take it also. A small station is a patient thing. It waits for the train. And when the train stops coming, it waits for whatever comes next. Be kind to the building. The coffee tastes better here than anywhere else on the division. I have never found out why. Josiah Ashcroft, Station Agent, Millbrook Junction, June 17, 1955. I read the letter twice. Then I folded it carefully, and I put it back in its envelope. I sat on the cold plank floor of that ticket booth, and I held the brass compass in my hand. 2 compasses, mine around my neck, hers, his in my hand, which had been hers first. He had loved her, not the way a man loves a woman he means to marry, the way a teacher loves a student who becomes the reason he keeps teaching, the way a lonely person loves the one bright week of a long gray year. He had loved her, and he had held that love, quietly, for 21 years, alone in this depot. And she had never come. But she had come, in her way. She had come in 2010 to Bedford County Records. She had paid for 15 years. She had left a map and a key in a wooden box with Hazel Kominski. She had done every single thing a woman can do to make sure that eventually, one day, a girl with her blood would walk into this ticket booth and find what Josiah Ashcroft had left. I did not cry. My grandmother had not been a woman who cried, and Josiah Ashcroft did not seem to have been a man who cried. But I said out loud to the empty depot, I said, Mr. Ashcroft, I am here. I found it. I said, she was my grandmother, and she did not forget you. I said, I will try. I put everything in my duffel bag. I walked out. I climbed into the passenger side of Ellis Radcliffe's green pickup. He did not ask me anything. He drove me back to Bedford. I got back to Hazel's apartment at 9 that evening. Hazel was waiting up. She had made stew. I set the tin lockbox on her kitchen table. I opened the lid. She looked in. She said, "Oh, Cordelia." That was all she said. Just her friend's name. I told her the whole story. I read her the letter. It took an hour, because I kept having to stop. When I was done, Hazel sat very still. Then she said, "Wren, your grandmother told me about him. Once. Only once. In the summer of 1991. We were in the yard on a night shift. She had had 2 whiskeys after her supper break, and she told me about a station agent in the foothills who had been the first person in her life to look at her and see a switchman. She said he had given her a compass, and then he had sent her out into the world and told her to walk her own line. She said she had always meant to go back and thank him, and she never did. Hazel wiped her eyes. She said, "Wren, she built this for you because he built it for her. She waited 7 years after she died to make sure you got here." I said, "Hazel." She said, "Yes, honey." I said, "I am going to fix that depot up." She said, "I know you are." I said, "I do not know how." She said, "I do." She said, "I have $15,000 in a passbook savings account at the credit union on Main Street. Every dollar I have saved since Stephen died in 2011. I said, "Hazel, no. I cannot take." She said, "Wren Marlene Prosser." I stopped talking. She said, "I have no children. My husband has been dead 12 years. You are Cordelia's granddaughter, and you are Marlene's daughter. And now you are, in a way I have no other word for, mine." She said, "You are not taking anything. I am giving. Do you understand the difference?" I could not speak. She said, "Nod." I nodded. She said, "Good. Eat your stew." I ate my stew. I moved out to the depot at the end of January. Hazel drove me in a rented U-Haul with a mattress, a folding cot, 2 boxes of books, a cast iron kettle, a small kerosene camp stove, a Coleman lantern, and 30 pounds of dried beans. The depot had no power and no running water. The well behind the freight room turned out to be sound. With a new hand pump, we had cold, clean water that tasted faintly of iron and stone. Hazel said it tasted like the water in the little town in Poland where her mother had been born. She sat on the platform bench and drank 2 cups of it in a row and cried a little. By the end of the first week, the news had traveled. A retired railroad engineer named Roland Kettering showed up in a rusted-out Ford pickup with a wooden crate in the truck bed. He was 78. He had a full head of white hair and hands the size of dinner plates. He set the crate on the platform without a word. Then he looked at me. He said, "You are the granddaughter." I said, "Yes." He said, "Cordelia was a friend of mine." 1972 through 84. I was engineer. She was switchman. She saved my life once. I never got to pay it back. He said, "I brought some things." He opened the crate. 2 brass conductor's lanterns. 3 enamel railroad mugs, with a Pennsylvania Railroad keystone stamped on the side. A folded canvas mailbag. A section of original rail. A porcelain sign that said "Men" from some vanished depot along the line. And a hand-painted wooden board that read, "Millbrook JCT, coffee." He said, "You are going to serve coffee here. I could see it on your face the second I met you." I said, "How did you know?" He said, "Because Josiah Ashcroft served coffee here for 26 years. And your grandmother worshipped Josiah Ashcroft. And you are her." He set the sign against the outside wall. It sat there like it had been made to fit that spot. Because it had been. Then he shook my hand. And he got in his truck. And he drove away. He came back every other Sunday for the rest of the year. A retired carpenter named Otis Brannigan came the next week. He was 74. His hands looked like they belonged to a man of 90. His mind belonged to a man of 50. He spent a whole Saturday on the roof with a bundle of cedar shingles. He would not take a dime. He said, "Miss Prosser, my wife died last May. If I do not have something to do on Saturdays, I will lose my mind. Pay me in coffee when you have coffee." Reverend Dalton came from the little Methodist chapel 1 mile west, where Josiah Ashcroft had preached on Sundays. Reverend Dalton was a woman in her 50s named Ruth Dalton. She read the story of the depot in the Bedford Gazette in April. She drove up in her Subaru with a covered casserole and a stack of quilts made by the church women. She said, "Miss Prosser, Josiah Ashcroft is buried in our churchyard. Would you like to come see his grave sometime?" I said, "Yes, very much." She said, "When you are ready, come. He will be glad." I found the Bible in the drawer of the agent's desk the second week. I was cleaning the desk. I pulled out the bottom drawer. Stuck. I worked at it. It came loose. Inside, a Bible. Small. Leather cover, cracked with age. A dark green cloth bookmark in the Book of Ruth. My grandmother's middle name had been Ruth. I opened to that page, and a photograph fell out. Black and white. Small. An old man in a station agent's uniform. Standing on the platform. Squinting at the camera. And beside him, a young woman. 17 years old. Braid over her shoulder. Cotton dress. Her hand shading her eyes. Laughing at whoever was taking the picture. My grandmother. I turned the photograph over. Not old writing. Newer. Shakier. My grandmother's late-in-life handwriting. August 2010. I promised him I would come back. I did not come back in time. But I am sending someone better than me. Wren, if you find this, do not do what I did. Do not wait. Cordelia. She had come. Then a car came up the railbed. I could hear it before I saw it. Wheels crunching on the frost. A white SUV. Immaculate. The kind of vehicle you buy when you want people to know you have money you did not earn. The passenger door opened. Brindley stepped out. She was holding her phone up already. Filming. Then the driver's door opened. Darlene, in a long camel coat and knee-high black boots and a scarf that cost more than my mattress. She looked around the clearing. She looked at the depot. She looked at the platform. She smiled. The smile of a woman who had just done the math. She turned toward the depot. She saw me standing at the ticket booth window. She waved. Then she said something to Brinley. And Brinley laughed. And Brinley kept filming. And Darlene started walking toward the platform. Because a woman like Darlene did not drive 4 hours into the Allegheny foothills in a white SUV to say she was sorry. She had smelled money. And she had come to take it. I put the Bible down on the desk. I put the photograph in my breast pocket. Over my heart. I opened the door of the ticket booth. I stepped out into the waiting room. And I walked, slowly, toward the front door of my depot. To meet the woman who had thrown me out into the snow. Which I did. I stepped out onto the platform. I said, "Darlene." She said, "Wren, sweetheart." I said, "Do not call me that." She said, "Wren." Then, "Fine. Can we talk?" I said, "You have 5 minutes." She said, "Aren't we in a mood?" Brinley was still filming. I looked directly at Brinley. I said, "Turn that off, or I will call the sheriff." Brinley did not turn it off. I said, "Fine." I turned to Darlene. I said, "Talk." She said, "Honey, this is not going to go the way you think." And in that moment, standing on that platform, I looked at my stepmother, and I said quietly, I said, "Darlene," I said, "it is not going to go the way you think either." And I meant it. Darlene came up the platform steps one at a time. Slow, deliberate. Like a woman inspecting a house she was thinking of buying. She reached the top. She stood beside me. She put her hand on the wooden railing that Otis Brannigan had rebuilt the week before. She looked out over the empty railbed. She said, "Well, isn't this quaint?" I said nothing. She said, "Wren, I have a proposition for you." I said nothing. She said, "My lawyer has looked at the deed. There are irregularities." I said, "There are no irregularities." She said, "Sweetheart, you were living in my house at the time you signed those papers." I said, "Your house." She said, "Our house." I said, "My grandmother's house." She said, "Legally." I said, "Do not." She said, "Wren." I said, "Say your proposition." She smiled. Because she thought she had me. She said, "You sign over 50% of this property to me, and in exchange, I will not pursue the fraud claim." I said, "What fraud?" She said, "You were a dependent. You represented yourself to Bedford County as an independent adult. You bought this property with what the court might consider marital funds." I said, "I bought this property with $12 from my coat lining." She said, "That is not the point." I said, "What is the point?" She said, "The point, Wren, is that I can make your life very difficult. Or you can be reasonable, and we can be a family again." Family. She used that word. I did not laugh. Because you do not laugh in the face of a woman who has already shown you what she is willing to do. But something in me went very still. Very cold. In the way water goes cold before it freezes. I said, "Darlene," I said, "take your daughter. Get in your SUV. Drive back to Marigold Street. And do not come back here." She said, "Or," I said, "or you will find out what a Sutcliffe woman does when she is done being polite." She laughed. She said, "Sweetie, you are 22. You work at a diner. I do not think you are going to do very much." I said nothing. Brinley was still filming. Darlene said, "Emmett is on my side by the way. In case you were wondering. I said. I was not. She said. He said you were always dramatic. I said. Get off my platform. She said. Your platform. I said. Yes. My platform. And your 5 minutes are up. She stood there for another moment, weighing me. I did not break. She turned. She walked down the steps. Brindley followed, still filming. At the bottom, Darlene turned back. She said, I will see you in court, Wren. I said, you will see me before that. She said, what is that supposed to mean? I said, nothing. But I meant this. I meant that a woman who has been prepared for by 3 generations of women does not walk into a fight alone. They drove away. I stood on the platform until the sound of the SUV disappeared into the trees. Then my knees gave out. I sat down on the top step. I put my head in my hands. I breathed. Just breathed. In for 4. Out for 6. The way my mother had taught me when I was 9 years old and had my first panic attack over a math test. When I could stand again, I went inside. I sat at Josiah Ashcroft's desk. I picked up my phone. I called Hazel. I told her everything. She listened. She did not interrupt. When I was done, she said, Wren. I said, yes. She said, do not call a lawyer yet. I said, what? She said, do not call a lawyer. Not yet. I said, Hazel, she is going to sue me. She said, let her file. Filing is not winning. And while she is filing, we are going to do something better than sue her back. I said, what? She said, we are going to open your cafe. Something in me lifted. She said, you have Otis and Roland and Ruth and half the county behind you. It is time. We open. And we tell the truth. Loudly. In public. And we let the light do the rest. I said, Hazel. She said, Wren. I said, okay. She said, good. Now eat something. Tomorrow is going to be a very long day. I did not eat. But I did sleep. Eventually. With Josiah's Bible on the nightstand beside me. And both compasses. Mine around my neck. His under my pillow. She came the next morning at 10. Juniper Holloway. 26 years old. She parked a dented Honda Civic at the edge of the clearing. She got out. She was wearing hiking boots and a puffer vest and a knit cap over dark red hair. She had a camera around her neck and a notebook in her back pocket. She walked up to the platform. She stopped at the bottom of the steps. She said, you are Wren Prosser. I said, yes. She said, I was hiking the old rail bed and I stopped for water. I have been sitting on that bench for 20 minutes reading your hand-lettered sign. I have questions. I said, come up. She came up. She sat on the bench Otis had built. She uncapped a water bottle. She said, without any preamble, tell me the story of this place. So I did. I told her about my grandmother, and Josiah Ashcroft, and the $12, and Merle Radcliffe, and Hazel Kominsky, and the wooden box, and the letter, and the 2 compasses. Not the money. I did not tell her about the money. That was between me and Josiah. She listened without writing anything down. She just watched my face. When I was done, she was quiet for a while. Then she said, Wren. I said, yes. She said, I grew up in a rail town too. My grandfather was a brakeman for Norfolk Southern for 35 years. He raised me after my mother left. He is the reason I do what I do for a living," she said. "When he died, 3 years ago, some corporation bought the little train museum he had volunteered at for 20 years. They tore it down. They put up a self-storage. I watched them do it. I stood across the street, and I watched them do it. And I thought, never again. Not on my watch," she said. "I do social media consulting now. That is what I do for a living. I help small businesses tell their stories online. I was hiking today because I needed to think about a client. Instead, I found you," she said. "I want to help you. Free. Because a story like this one is what I have been waiting to find for 3 years. And because if I can help save this depot the way I could not save my grandfather's museum, then maybe I will finally be able to sleep at night." I sat down beside her on the bench. I said, "June." She said, "Wren." I said, "Yes. Please help me." She said, "Thank you." We shook on it. Then we got to work. June was a hurricane. She was on her phone within an hour, making a list. Then a longer list. Then a schedule. She said the launch would be a Saturday in June, on the anniversary of the last passenger train. She said we would call it the 642 Junction Cafe. She said the 2 paintings had to happen first. I said, "What 2 paintings?" She said, "Your mother. Your grandmother. On the wall behind the counter. Full length. In their railroad uniforms." I said, "I do not have money for a painter." She said, "My cousin is a painter. In Pittsburgh. She owes me a favor." I said, "Are you sure?" She said, "Wren, trust me on this. People do not fall in love with a coffee shop. People fall in love with the women behind the coffee shop. If your mother and grandmother are on that wall in real oil paint, looking down at every person who walks in, this place will never be empty. Not one day." She was right. June's cousin drove up from Pittsburgh. Her name was Annalise. She was 30. She had short dark hair and paint on her hands that never washed off. She spent 2 weekends at the depot. She used the framed photographs I had. She painted them side by side, 6 feet high, on stretched canvas. My mother with her clipboard in her Conrail jacket. My grandmother with her switch lever in her Pennsylvania Railroad overalls. Both of them looking straight out at the viewer. Not smiling, not solemn. Just present. Just there. When we hung the 2 paintings on the back wall, the whole depot changed. The room had been beautiful before. It became sacred. Reverend Dalton came the next day, stood in the middle of the waiting room, looked up at the paintings, cried, just quietly. She said, "Oh, Josiah, look what she built." Opening day was the 3rd Saturday of June. I got up at 4 in the morning. I lit the potbelly stove. I filled Josiah's old cast iron kettle. I ground coffee beans by hand. I put out the enamel Pennsylvania Railroad mugs Roland Kettering had brought me. I lit the 2 brass conductor's lanterns. At 5, I opened the door. The first person to walk through it was Roland Kettering, in his good jacket. He came in, and he stopped, and he saw the paintings, and he took his cap off, and he stood there. I poured him a cup of coffee, in an enamel mug. I set it down in front of him. He said, "Miss Prosser." I said, "Yes." He said, "This is the first cup of coffee served in this station in 68 years. I said, "Yes, it is." He said, "To Josiah." I said, "To Josiah." He drank it standing up. He did not sit down until the cup was empty. Then he came around behind the counter, and he put his hand on my shoulder. And he did not say anything. And he did not need to. By 6, the local construction crew from the county road repair had come in. 5 men. Muddy boots. Thermoses. They stopped inside the door and stared at the paintings. Then at the coffee. Then at me. One of them said, "How much?" I said, "Nothing. Not for you." "Not before noon." He said, "What?" I said, "Coffee is free until noon. For anyone who works with their hands. That is the rule. After noon it is $4 a cup. For everybody else." He stared at me. He said, "Every day." I said, "Every day the depot is open." He said, "Ma'am, who made that rule?" I said, "A man named Josiah Ashcroft. In 1937, he served coffee free to the switchmen. I am just keeping his rule." The 5 of them stood in a line and drank coffee out of enamel mugs that had been made in 1942. And when they left, one of them dropped a $20 bill into the tin can Hazel had labeled tips for Josiah. He said, "That is not a tip. That is for the next crew that comes in cold." June was in the back of the room, filming. By 8, the tourists started arriving. Not many. It was the first day. But some. By 10, there were 40 people on the platform. By 2 in the afternoon, June had posted the video. Me telling the story. Standing behind the counter, in front of my mother and my grandmother. By 6 that night, we had 60,000 views. By Monday morning, we had 400,000. By Friday, we had 1.2 million. It was not the biggest viral moment on the internet that year. But it was ours. And it was enough. And the right kind of people found it. By the end of June, the parking clearing was full every Saturday. Cars from as far as Cleveland. A woman drove from Rochester, New York, with her 3 grown daughters. She said she had been a rail dispatcher for 11 years and had never had a place to go and remember. Now she did. The Bedford Gazette wrote a full-page article. Then a follow-up. Then a third piece. A regional public radio station out of Pittsburgh drove down and did an interview. I said what I had said to June. Straight through. No script. Just the truth. I never once said my stepmother's name. I never once said my father's name. I did not have to. Because the internet had done what the internet does. Somebody had gone looking. Somebody had found Brinley's original Christmas Eve video. The one where she had filmed a 22-year-old girl crying in the snow. The one where she said, "Merry Christmas, loser," into her camera. I did not put it out there. June did not put it out there. But it came out. Wren Prosser worked as a claims supervisor at a regional insurance office. Within 2 weeks, her employer's public contact page was flooded with complaints. Not angry ones. Just calm, one-line messages. This is the woman who filmed her stepdaughter being locked out on Christmas Eve. Are you comfortable with her handling insurance claims for widows? 3 weeks after the video resurfaced, Darlene was let go. Officially, it was a restructuring. Everyone in Bedford knew what it was. Brinley had been chasing brand deals, wearing dresses she could not afford. Her sponsors, 3 small local ones, quietly stopped answering her emails. Her account was reported, so many times it was placed under a temporary hold. I did not tell anyone to do any of this. You know what my grandmother used to say? Wren, if you build a lighthouse, you do not have to chase the ships, and you do not have to punish the rocks. You just build, and the rocks will show themselves, because that is what rocks do. When there is light, I built the lighthouse. The rocks showed themselves. In August, I got a phone call. The woman on the line introduced herself. Her name was Priscilla Merriweather, 34 years old. Bedford. She was an attorney. She had been reading about the depot. She said, "Miss Prosser, may I come out to the depot next week and talk to you?" I said, "About what?" She said, "About your grandmother's house." I said, "There is nothing to do about my grandmother's house." She said, "Miss Prosser, I have been an attorney in Bedford for 8 years. I looked up the transfer on your grandmother's house. Public record. It took me 20 minutes. I want to talk to you about what I found." She came to the depot the following Tuesday. She was small, sharp, dark suit, glasses. She sat at one of the little round tables I had set up. She ordered a cup of coffee. She paid for it because it was afternoon. She put a folder on the table. She said, "Wren, your father did not sign that transfer." I said, "What?" She said, "I compared the signature on the deed transfer to 5 other documents your father signed in the same calendar year. His signature has a very distinctive E. The one on the deed does not. It is close enough to have fooled the notary, but it is not his signature." I could not speak. She said, "It is your stepmother's signature, in your father's hand." I said, "Are you sure?" She said, "I am sure enough to take this to court, if you would like me to, free of charge." I said, "Why?" She said, "Because I saw the paintings on your wall when I walked in." She said, "My grandmother worked the ticket window at the Altoona Amtrak station for 29 years. She was a Sicilian immigrant who had 5 words of English when she started, and she was the reason I went to law school, because she made me believe that ordinary women in unglamorous jobs deserve better lawyers than the ones they got." She said, "When I saw those paintings on your wall, I thought of her." She said, "I want to work for you, Wren, not because I feel sorry for you, because I feel proud of you. There is a difference." I sat back in my chair. I looked up at the 2 paintings. My mother, my grandmother. They were looking at me. I looked at Priscilla. I said, "Yes." She said, "Good." She opened her folder. We filed in September. The case took 7 months. I will not walk you through the 7 months, because they were long and ugly, but the facts were the facts. Priscilla brought in a handwriting expert. She brought in the notary, who was not, it turned out, willing to lie for Darlene when actual jail time became a possibility. The notary said, in a deposition, that Darlene had brought her the papers already signed. She said she had not watched my father sign them. She had assumed. The judge was a woman, 61 years old, named Bernadette Sowerby. She had grown up in Cambria County. Her father had been a coal miner. She listened. She read the papers. She looked at Darlene during Darlene's testimony the way my grandmother would have looked at her. The ruling came down in April of 2024. The transfer was void. The house on Marigold Street was returned to the estate of Cordelia Sutcliffe, which meant it passed to my mother, which meant, because my mother had died before her mother, it passed to me. I stood in that courtroom. I did not cry. I looked at Darlene across the aisle. She did not look at me. She was looking at the floor. Emmett was in the row behind her. He was looking at me. He mouthed the word, "Sorry." I did not nod. I did not shake my head. I just looked at him. Then I walked out of the courtroom, with Priscilla Merriweather, and I went back to my depot, and I made coffee at 5 a.m. the next morning, because that is what a station does. I did not move into the Marigold Street house. I asked Hazel to come with me the day the keys were handed over. We stood on the porch. The same porch. The porch where I had stood on Christmas Eve 2022. I said, "Hazel, I want you to have this house." She said, "Wren." I said, "I lived in it for 22 years. I do not want it. It was my grandmother's. And you loved her back for 28 years. And you have lived in a 2-room apartment over a laundromat for the whole of your widowhood. I want you to live in this house." She said, "Wren, I cannot." I said, "Yes, you can. You will, because I am putting the deed in your name whether you like it or not." She cried. She hit my arm. Not hard. She said I was the most stubborn woman she had ever known besides Cordelia Sutcliffe. I said, "Good. That was the point." She moved in 3 weeks later. Darlene lost her job. She lost her husband. Emmett filed for divorce 2 months after the ruling, not because he was brave, but because Darlene, without the house and without a paycheck, became a woman even Emmett could not stand to live with. Brinley moved to Philadelphia, started over under her real first name, which was not Brinley. She has not tried to come back. Darlene lives, as far as I know, in a small rental unit outside Bedford. She works at a discount store. I hope she is well. I do not think about her often. The house on Marigold Street belongs to Hazel Kominski now. The depot at Millbrook Junction belongs to me. On a rainy afternoon in October of 2024, 6 months after the ruling, a car came up the railbed. It was Emmett. He parked at the far edge of the clearing. He got out. He stood beside his car for a long time before he walked to the platform. He was thinner than I remembered. His hair was mostly gray. He climbed the platform steps slowly. Like his knees hurt. I was standing in the doorway, watching him. He stopped 10 feet away from me. He said, "Wren." I said, "Dad." He said, "Can I come in?" I said, "Yes." He came in. He stopped inside the door. He looked at the paintings. He stood there for a very long time. He said, "Your mother." He said, "Your mother." He put his hand over his mouth. He turned his face away. I did not go to him. I did not know how. He got himself together. He turned back to me. He said, "Can I sit down?" I said, "Yes." He sat at the wooden bench along the wall. I sat at the other end. Not close. Not far. I said, "Coffee." He said, "Please." I got up. I made him a cup, in one of Roland Kettering's enamel mugs. I set it down in front of him. He put both hands around it. He said, "Wren, I do not have any right to be here." I said, "No." He said, "I know that." I said, "Good." He said, "I did not come to ask for anything." I said, "Then why did you come?" He said, "Because I owe you an apology. And I have owed it to you for 4 years. I could not give it to you in that house, because that house had her in it. And I could not give it to you in the courtroom, because I was too ashamed." He said, "I am not asking you to forgive me." I said, "Good." He said, "I am asking you to let me sit here for an hour and drink this cup of coffee, and then I will go. And if you never want to see me again, you will never see me again." I looked at him. He was small on that bench. I said, Dad. He said. Yes. I said. I am not going to pretend it did not happen. He said. I know. I said. But I can sit here with you for a cup of coffee. That is what I can give you today. He looked at me. He nodded. He said, that is more than I deserve. I said, it is not about what you deserve. It is about what I have. We sat there for an hour. Almost no words. He drank his coffee. He watched the rain outside the bay window. Twice he looked up at the paintings and then down at his hands. Once he said, without looking at me, she was better than I ever deserved. I did not know if he meant my mother, or my grandmother, or me, maybe all three. When the hour was up, he stood. He set the empty mug on the counter. He looked at me one more time. He said, thank you, Wren. I said, drive carefully. That was all. He walked out. He got in his car. He drove away. He came back one time after that, in November, for another cup of coffee. We sat for a shorter time. He did not ask for anything. He may come again. I do not know. I do not need him to. Christmas Eve, 2025. 3 years to the day since Darlene locked the front door behind me. The depot was full of lights. June had strung white bulbs along the eaves. Otis had built a small Christmas tree stand for the platform, and Roland had donated an old spruce he cut himself. It stood at the edge of the tracks, wrapped in lights, reflecting in the melting snow. Inside the waiting room, Reverend Dalton had brought the choir from the Methodist chapel. 15 people. They sang carols. Their voices carried in the small warm room. Hazel was sitting in the rocking chair beside the potbelly stove. She was 72 years old. Red sweater. Her braid pinned up in a bun. She was drinking hot cider. Otis was there. Roland was there. Merle and Ellis Radcliffe were there. Ruth Dalton was there. Priscilla Merriweather was there, with her husband and 2 small children. Annalise had driven up from Pittsburgh with her partner. June was in the corner with her phone, but she was not filming. She was just watching. The 2 paintings hung on the back wall. My mother, my grandmother. On the desk in the ticket booth, both brass compasses sat side by side. Mine, his, both pointing north. I stood behind the counter, pouring coffee for a family from Ohio who had driven 6 hours to see the depot. The father said, Miss Prosser. I said, yes. He said, my wife's mother worked for Penn Central for 18 years. She died last spring. My wife has been having a hard time. She saw your video. She said she needed to come here. I looked at his wife. She was standing beside the paintings, looking up at them. She had tears in her eyes, but she was smiling. I said, please tell her the coffee is on the house. He said, it is Christmas Eve. I said, yes. He said, thank you. He took the mugs to his wife. I stood behind the counter. I looked out at all of these people, some of whom had known me since I was small, some of whom had met me last spring, some of whom I had met that night for the first time. And I thought about forgiveness, because I know you are wondering about it. I did not forgive my father in that hour in October. I did not even try. But I did something that mattered more than forgiveness. I gave him 1 hour in my depot, with my mother watching from the wall, and my grandmother watching from the wall. I did not take his hand. I did not tell him it was all right, because it was not all right, and it never will be. But I let him sit there, and I sat with him, That is what my grandmother would have called ballast. Sometimes the best thing a woman can do is put ballast in her own boat, so she does not tip over. When the storm passes, whether the storm apologizes or not, you do not have to forgive to survive. You do not have to hate to survive either. You just have to put your ballast in your own boat, and keep the coffee hot, and open the door at 5 a.m., and do the work. Reverend Dalton walked over to the counter. She looked at me. She smiled. She said, "Wren." I said, "Ruth." She said, "Merry Christmas." I said, "Merry Christmas." She said, "Would you like me to say a blessing?" I said, "Yes, please." She turned to the room. She raised her hands. She said, "Lord, on this cold night, in this small warm place, we thank you for the women who came before us, for the women who prepared the way, for the women who saved us when we did not know we needed saving. We thank you for Cordelia, for Marlene, for Adeline, for Josiah, who was not a woman, but who understood them, for Hazel, for all the hands that built this place." She paused. She said, "And Lord, we thank you for Wren, who opened the door." She said, "Amen." The room said, "Amen." I put my hand on the brass compass under my sweater. I put my other hand on the wooden counter Josiah Ashcroft had leaned on for 26 years. I looked up at the paintings. My mother was smiling. Or I thought she was. Or maybe it was the light. My grandmother was not smiling. She was just looking at me, the way she used to look at me when she was proud, but did not want to embarrass either of us by saying so. She was proud. I could feel it. A small station is a patient thing. It waits for the train. And when the train stops coming, it waits for whatever comes next. Josiah Ashcroft waited for me for 68 years, without knowing my name. Cordelia Sutcliffe waited for me in the shape of a brass compass on a leather cord. Wren Prosser waited for me in the color of my eyes. Hazel Kominski waited for me above a coin laundry on a snowy street in Bedford. Merle Radcliffe waited for me in a drawer of the county records office for 12 years. Otis and Roland, and Ruth and June and Priscilla waited for me too, each in their own quiet way, without knowing they were waiting. And the depot itself, the little red building, with its slate floor, and its potbelly stove, and its loose boards beneath a ticket booth stool, had waited for me for 68 years. Patient, faithful, because that is what a station is. There are doors that people close in your face. And you stand on the porch, in the snow. You are 22 years old. You have $20 in your coat, and you think it is the end. And it is not the end, because the door that closed behind you was not the last door. It was the door that turned you toward the door that had been waiting for you. Sometimes the cruelest people in our lives think they are shutting us out. They are not. They are opening. They just do not know what they are opening, or where the door leads. I know where mine led. Mine led to a red board and batten depot in the Allegheny foothills, where a man named Josiah Ashcroft loved my grandmother enough to leave $9,400 under the floor of a ticket booth in 1955, where my grandmother, 73 years old, drove up from Coldwater in 2010 to pay a fee she could barely afford, so that her granddaughter would have a place to go, if she ever needed one, which, as it turned out, she did. The choir began to sing again. Someone laughed. Someone cried a little. Hazel dozed in the rocking chair, with her cider growing cold in her hand. Outside, the snow began to fall. Slow, gentle, steady, without any hurry. The kind of snow that a small station in the Allegheny foothills has been catching on its slate roof for 114 winters, and will keep catching for as many more winters as the world will allow it. Because a woman named Wren Prosser bought it for $12 on a Wednesday morning in January. And she was not going to let it fall. Not on her watch. Not ever.